NFL Network's Tom Pelissero joins me today. And Tom, you were recently at the TCO Performance Center, in which we saw a lot of your takes on NFL Network. But one thing the camera did not show, they didn't pan down towards your feet. You had on the candy apple red retro Jordan 5, so I'm sure that's in the rotation today, right?
I never had those shoes growing up. I remember, being jealous of kids. I had some of the later Jordans. I never had those ones. So when I saw they got re-released as a running shoe, I was like, all right, it's go time. It matches the NFL Network colors. I appreciate it. You're the only person who picked it out. Credit to you, Gabe.
You were at TCO. Speaking of the Vikings right now, what were some of your takeaways from being at TCO the other day?
Well, I think the first thing was just some of the rookies on this team, the draft picks. We know that the Vikings, there's a lot of the veteran players, the big names that fans are familiar with that are no longer a part of the team. But there are some guys who immediately, and I was out there on the second padded practice at training camp, immediately look the part. Justin Jefferson, the things that they think they can do with that receiver from LSU. One thing the Vikings really liked about him coming out of college was his intelligence, the fact that he could learn a lot of different positions. He understood concepts. So they're not holding back. They expect him to be able to play inside, outside, learn all the different receiver positions. And certainly when I talked to Coach Mike Zimmer, that was one thing he said. You look at the speed, you look at the route running, and you look at the ability to high point the football. All those things give him the chance to stress defenses immediately here. And let's face it, the Vikings are going to need him to do that with Stephon Diggs gone, as a compliment now to Adam Thielen. You look at some of the other draft picks on this team, Jeff Gladney, who I know has kind of come along here of late. He was working, in the nickel, first-round draft pick out of TCU, a guy they did a ton of homework on. And then Cam Dantzler. I read everything else. I wasn't out there day one in pads. I knew he had knocked down that throw to Adam Thielen, and that Thielen made a comment to Mike Zimmer about how good he can be. Mm-hmm. And then sure enough, in one of the team drills, it's Cam Dantzler, third-round pick from Mississippi State again, picking off Kirk Cousins. Those are three guys, along with Ezra Cleveland, the second-round draft pick, who they're throwing a lot at him too, learning an entirely new position, playing guard right now. All those guys you would think are going to have a chance to compete, be on the field early, and given the changes at receiver and corner, I think you're going to be hearing all three of those names a lot.
For sure. And you talk about, those rookies, and Justin Jefferson in particular. He can't get the ball if the offensive line doesn't block. It's great to have that continuity. 4 starters returning from last year, but that left guard position with that void right there, how long do you let that position battle play out before you start getting into the season?
Usually with position battles, especially on the offensive line, you'd want to get through a preseason game or two and then begin focusing on the continuity of let's let these guys work together, start to gel. Let's pick a guy and go with it. Well, you don't have preseason games now. Right. And that's where I think the entire rhythm of how all this comes together, roster setting, figuring out who are going to be the bottom guys on your team, figuring out trades, whether you're, where do we have depth to deal somebody, who's going to be available. Everybody's kind of running behind from what I've heard within the league. There's just far fewer of those conversations taking place right now. So specifically to the Vikings offensive line, it's early, but it's not. It's hard to make a decision that quickly, but I would certainly think within the next week to week and a half, you're going to want to be, making some decisions, evaluating not just the team drills, but the one-on-ones, everything else, and figuring out, okay, at least in week one, we got to make a decision here.
Right. With the nature right now with no preseason games, is there any value in having, live tackling periods at training camp, or is it about staying healthy? How do you balance that out?
It's a great question, and every coach has to evaluate that. I know there's a bunch of teams, including the Vikings, who have talked about doing some version of scrimmages, whether it's an entire game or a half or periods that are live with tackling. There's also a lot of teams that historically have not used their starters at all in the preseason or very minimally. And, a lot of coaches in recent years have not tackled as much in practice. I would think that every team in the league is going to have some live drills just because you don't want that technique to be, completely go away. You don't want the first time you hit somebody to be week one in a regular season game. But, there's also something about management here and being smart with players' bodies in general. We know that they had the longer two-week or so acclimatization period prior to players beginning to practice and then moving into pads. But you only get about a dozen padded practices, I think it is, before week one. How do you, manage those with some of your veterans? Do you have them in pads for every one of those days? Or do you hold guys back and only have them go every other? Those are all things that, they got a ton of technology to evaluate that now. This year, even as as important, if not more so than past years. You're really going to want to be smart about that and managing things and figuring out how do we get guys ready for week one, but how do we also not put them in a position where they're at risk prior to getting to week one.
There's somewhat of an early bye week for the Vikings this upcoming season, coming in at week 7. How much of a benefit do you think it has for the Vikings having an early bye like that early on?
You know, it's always difficult to say because you never know what a team's injury situation is going to be when their bye comes up. I think that everybody would always like it to be middle of the season or a little bit after, just because of how the rhythm of things work out and you want to get healed up for a stretch run. But sometimes, you know, if they have a slew of injuries in weeks 4, 5, 6, that week 7 bye is suddenly going to look like the perfect time for them. You know, same thing with, you know, the fact that COVID-19 you're going to be dealing with all season. There are a lot of good signs for the NFL in terms of the very low positivity rate on the tests, well below 1% right now. The fact that as we're taping this, there's only 6 guys left league-wide on the reserve COVID-19 list, you would take all those as good signs. We don't ultimately know what's going to happen here. You're having more, you know, face-to-face contact, padded practices, then you're moving into games. There's travel. The exposure levels are much lower than you have in, say, Major League Baseball in terms of travel, because there's no 4-day road trips in the NFL. You're going from the facility to the airport to the hotel to the stadium back to the airport. That's your trip. You're not leaving. You can't even, they released the updated travel protocols yesterday. Not only can you not go dine in at a restaurant, you can't even go pick up takeout. You check into the hotel and then it's lockdown. But you just don't know. None of this, you know, we don't know. We don't know in a good or bad way. We don't know how the testing may improve, saliva testing. You know, could that end up being a game changer for the NFL? All of which is a long way of saying that you ultimately have more unknowns even in this season than others. And so in terms of the schedule and how things shake out, health is always huge, and this year that also happens to include a global pandemic.
Kirk Cousins, how much of the offensive success do you put on him?
Well, as long as Mike Zimmer's the coach, this is a Vikings team that's going to be defined by their defense and by their running game, and they have a very good running back.
Hand off Dalvin Cook, makes a man miss. He has a safety to beat. It's Darnell Savage, and he beat him. Touchdown!
But Kirk, you know, you have to rely on him to make the plays that he needs to. You need to be balanced. If everybody's going to gang up to stop Dalvin, you've got to be able to hurt him in the passing game. And Kirk Cousins, he overcame some things last year. You know, when I talked to Mike Zimmer, that's something that he said. Because I asked him, you know, really in your head, what is the next level for Kirk Cousins? And the 2 things he pointed out were, 1, making those big plays in the big moments, just like he did in New Orleans when they need him to. And then also using his legs more. So that certainly seems like that is continuing to be an emphasis for Cousins here. Not just, you know, sit in there, take a sack, throw the ball away, but maybe use your athletic ability a little bit more, because, you know, Kirk, I think it's at times when you watch him, he may not look like a guy who wants to get out and run, but when he actually starts running, he's got decent speed. It's not like he's running in molasses out there.
What's the next level for Danielle Hunter? Is 14.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, 70 tackles, is that enough to, you know, propel this Vikings defense to having a great season?
Well, with Danielle Hunter, I mean, he's been one of the best defensive ends for pretty much his entire career.
Breeze is back in. He's back to pass. Oh, who dropped it? It's a fumble, and yes, ball. Yes, we got that ball. Danielle Hunter caused the fumble, and the Vikings.
I've said to Danielle before, I've said to other people before, I feel like if he were an outsized personality who had crazy quotes and was constantly in the media, we would talk about him in the same breath as some of the top pass rushers in the game, but he's the most anonymous, perpetual 15-sack guy in the league. Danielle's already drawn attention from defenses. He's already been getting chipped. He's already been getting doubled. He's still really productive. You know, sacks are a finicky stat. You know, you look at the pressures, and he's always been one of the most disruptive linemen in the league. You know, a 14.5 sack season last year could be a 20-sack season this year. I mean, he's on course to be, if he's not already, one of the best in the league at his position, a core part of what the Vikings do. What I'm really interested to see, you know, how do they kind of, you know, balance out the line on the other side? Because when Danielle Hunter's on one side, you would think that some younger player on the other side is going to get favorable matchups, whether that's Ifeadi Odenigbo, who had, I think, 7 sacks last season, finally has found a home. I mean, he's been cut by 3 teams. It's a great story. Comes back to the team that drafted him, and now all of a sudden is a really productive player. If the season started today, he would be the starter. But they drafted DJ Wanham for a reason. You know, they drafted, I think, 3 edge guys in the draft. You know, they kind of look at this as it's probably not going to be one guy takes 800 snaps at right end this year. It's probably going to be more of a committee basis. But Odenigbo is certainly at the forefront of that, and you would think he would continue to have favorable opportunities to get after opposing passers.